So, AyerLogPosVerPrin and the verification principle is quite a complicated section, but it's quite a small section. So what I want to do is just talk through what the content is, and then I've done the answers as well, and those will appear down the way, and my version will also turn up as a copy that you can download or read at the end, so there's no need to try and write it down as it goes along. So, the verification principle, and what I've put then is like a subheading: why moral utterances are simply nonsense without content when they think they are saying something meaningful about the world. So that's to say that when you say this is wrong or this is right, you may think there is cognitivist content, that what you're saying is true or false. AyerLogPosVerPrin is going to argue that's not the case. When you say this is wrong or this is right, what you're speaking is literally nonsense. You're not saying anything meaningful at all about the world, because there is no cognitivist content in what you are saying. It isn't right, it isn't wrong, it's not true, it's not false. It's nonsense. So in this, he was very, very heavily influenced by David Hume, and he agreed with much of what Hume said, in fact pretty much all of what Hume said. So I've picked some of those out. Number one, morality cannot be a system of beliefs. We've seen that. Thought about the is-ought problem, thought about how beliefs never motivate us, rational beliefs never motivate us at all, only passions motivate us. AyerLogPosVerPrin was on board with all of that. He agreed with the is-ought gap, so no amount of descriptive statements, is statements, will ever give you a moral ought type statement. And he was broadly along lines as well, that things can be known are divided into analytic, which is relations of ideas, and synthetic, matters of fact. And so that's Hume's fork, and I've just reminded you of that below. So you've got relations of ideas, analytic, necessary a priori, and certain, and matters of fact, synthetic, contingent, a posteriori, probable. So, and they gave you an example. So, he takes Hume and he pushes him in a slightly different way, where Hume was talking about what we can know. AyerLogPosVerPrin is talking about what do our utterances, what do the things we say mean? Are some of our utterances, which of our utterances are meaningful? And so I've asked you to use an extract from Lacewing, and then an extract from AyerLogPosVerPrin himself, and then answer the following questions. So he says, this is AyerLogPosVerPrin, but he's quoting David Hume. So Eyre says, even this conclusion is not new, though it is only in recent times it has gained widespread acceptance. It is, for example, already implicit in the famous passage with which Hume concludes his book, An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. He has divided all the legitimate forms of study into abstract science, the only objects of which are quantity and number, so that's relations of ideas, number, and inquiries regarding matters of fact and existence, which can be founded only on experience. And he then continues, so that's Hume continues, when we run over libraries persuaded of these principles, what havoc must we make if we take in our hand any volume of divinity, so books about God, or school metaphysics, so metaphysics is things like right and wrong, and is there a God, and anything which isn't just straightforward science, really. For instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? Is it a relation of ideas? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames. It can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. So Eyre agrees with that, in effect. If it's not either a relation of ideas or a matter of fact, it doesn't really have any meaningful content. He sets out slightly differently, and again I quote him here, my own version of it, as expressed in my Language, Truth and Logic, which is his book, was that a sentence is factually significant to any given person. So factually significant means it means something to any given person if, and only if, he knows how to verify the proposition which it purports to express. That is, if he knows what observations would lead him under certain conditions to accept it as being true or reject it as being false. So if I were to say something like, Jonathan is a humph, and you say, you what? What does that mean? A humph? And you say, well, how would you show that someone was a humph? Now, if I say, well, if they're a humph, then they're this tall and that wide, and you go, okay, that's meaningful now, because you've tied the idea, the word, the expression, the utterance, humph, to some meaning in the world. But if I say, well, I can't show you what it means, I can't prove it's true or prove it's not true, and you think, well, it's not actually tied to the world at all. It doesn't really mean anything. You're just making noises. It's like the babbling noise of babies. Okay, and that's basically what Ayer is saying. That if when you say something, you actually can't show what would make what you're saying true or false, then effectively you're just making up sounds. That is not. It's not a million miles at all, actually, from what Hume was doing with ideas like causation, where he's saying, okay, so you've got this word causation. Let's look at what it really has behind it. And he says, well, there isn't any experience behind it, so it can't mean anything. We're going to have to redefine it. And he, as you might remember, went for constant conjunction. A.J. Ayer is going to do the same thing with things like moral language. He's going to say, can we show that when you say this is right or this is wrong, that what you're saying is meaningful, that you can prove that that's the case or show that that's the case in any way? A.J. Ayer thinks you cannot do that at all. There's no evidence from the world that could make what you're saying more or less likely. And so moral language is going to be literally nonsense. It has no real meaning. Okay? As he says, meaning was also accorded to sentences expressing propositions like those of logic or pure mathematics. So 1,000,000 plus 1,000,000 is 2,000,000. Yes, Ayer's fine with that. You don't have to give empirical evidence for it. That's just intuitively obvious. So effectively then, he is accepting in that passage the two parts of Hume's fork. Either you can show it in some way by experience, or you can show it a priori, but if it's neither, it doesn't mean anything. It is empty. And so, as he says, anything or everything of a would-be indicative character, everything which seems to say something about how the world is, which fails to satisfy the verification principle, he says, was dismissed as literally nonsensical. So then there are just a few questions underneath. I've accidentally turned that white. No, that's very unhelpful. That's better. So what is meant by verification? Now my answer to this is going to pop up in a minute, but equally I would just take you back here. To verify is to be able to show that what you say is either true or false. Yes. If I was to say Erin is 12 feet tall, that's meaningful, not because it's true, but because it is false. We could falsify what I am saying. So verification is simple, really. Logical positivists, the school of thought that Ayer belonged to, basically just saw verification as, is the statement that you are giving meaningful because you can show it to be true or show it to not be true. That's all that verification is. So verify, show it is true. And then question 2. That's all that verification is. So verify, show it is true. And then question 2, what 2 sorts of utterance is Ayer prepared to accept? And again, my answer to this will pop up, but I think this is pretty obvious actually here. It says it's factually significant if you know how to verify it, okay? And so through empirical means, or if it's a proposition which is a relation of ideas, logic and mathematics. So 2 sorts, relations of ideas and matters of fact where we can verify them as well. Okay. Quotation from Ayer above, you might think it's essential we can actually verify statements. But how does Lacewing show that Ayer softened this position? And he did. It was made very clear very quickly in the logical positivist school that actually this idea that it has to be totally verifiable was nonsense. That cannot be the case. So for instance, if you have a claim like all swans are white, or aspirin cures headaches, or similar, those are inductively gained. So we've gained more and more and more and more examples and become more and more and more confident about them, and so on and so forth. And yet we'd only need one black swan to wander in and we'd realise we had been wrong. So experience will never make an inductive claim certain. We never verify it beyond all doubt. Lacewing gives an example, as you'll have seen, about if you made a claim like there are 600 trillion planets in the universe. Now you could find evidence to make that increasingly likely, so you could look at millions and millions of stars and find that almost all of them have got planets, and there are definitely trillions of stars out there, so it's overwhelmingly likely that that many planets exist. And equally, you could say how you would verify it were you in a position to do so. So you might say, if we had a trillion telescopes and we launched each of them on a rocket in a different direction to look at different stars, we would be able to find that many. We haven't got those telescopes, we haven't got those rockets, but we know how we would verify it were it possible, were we able to do so. Okay, and that's a very different position from, say, verifying that if I say murder is right, it's not at all clear how you would verify that. So Ayer softens his position to allow not only those things which are absolutely verified as true or falsified as false, but those things which are made overwhelmingly likely by experience as well. are made overwhelmingly likely by experience as well. Questions 4 and 5, I thought some of you did less well because you missed out the other philosophers, which is what I was hoping you might think about. So, are moral utterances analytically true? Can they be derived by pure reason? So you will remember, I hope, that Kant would say yes. Yes, they are. You know, crack out your categorical imperative, act only on that maxim which you can at the same time will be a universal law, take your action, find its maxim, logically extend that to all people, see whether you come up with a contradiction in conception. Well, that's all a priori reasoning. So Kant would say, yes, yes you can. Ayer, on the other hand, looks at Hume and thinks, well, actually, when Hume said, you know, moral thinking, moral judgments are never beliefs, are never rational statements, he agrees with that. So it can't be pure reason because reason never motivates us. Reason is and must always be the slave of the passions. And so where Kant thinks, yes, reason can be the basis of morality, Ayer agrees with Hume and says, no, reason can't be the basis of morality. And we've done some work on that, and my answer develops that as well. And so moral utterances certainly are not relations of ideas. Okay. Relations of ideas. Okay then, are they instead verifiable by empirical evidence? Are moral statements matters of fact? Now, people like Bentham or Mill or Aristotle are going to say yes. Yes, by experimenting, by looking at the world, we can establish how the world ought to be. We can, for instance, empirically study consequences and say, oh, these consequences are overwhelmingly horrible. There's too much suffering. Our hedonic calculus is leaning in the wrong direction. This is a wrong action, yes? Or we have studied human beings. We have found their ergon. And from the ergon, we've established their telos, and so on and so forth. Ayer, again, follows Hume and notices the is-ought gap. And so he will say, well, no, it doesn't matter how many facts about how the world is you empirically establish, they will not give you anything about how the world ought to be. So he's going to say moral utterances are neither analytically true nor empirically verified. I mean, that's going to lead us very rapidly, I think, actually, to the claim then that they must be nonsense. If they're not one and they're not the other, they're nonsense. But I've put question 6 in here as well. But I've put question 6 in here as well. Why did Ayer dismiss More's non-naturalist intuitionism Well, if almost all of you put as the problem that you saw as the biggest issue with intuitionism, that if I intuit that your action is right and someone else intuits your action is wrong, well, first of all, how can we both be intuiting two different responses if it's self-evident? I mean, that's just a problem for more. That wasn't Ayer's issue. He was saying, well, if two people intuit different things and you can't give any empirical evidence to show which answer is right, then neither answer is right and neither answer is wrong. They're just not true fact. They don't have any cognitivist content. They're neither right nor wrong. So I had just dismissed more on that basis that there's nothing to test intuitions. There's no way of proving them or disproving them. So if moral utterances are neither matters of fact nor relations of ideas, they can't be verified and they are not true by definition, what would Ayer say they are? Well, he would be proving them. So if moral utterances are neither matters of fact nor relations of ideas, they can't be verified and they are not true by definition, what would Ayer say they are? Well, he would say they are nonsense. Yes, not nonsense in the brutal way in which someone gives you an answer, oh, that's nonsense, but nonsense. They don't actually mean anything. So you might compare that to, for instance, someone saying that the best band in the world is, I don't know, Guns N' Roses. And you might say, well, you're welcome to your attitude. You're welcome to think that. But that's not true and it's not false. That's just a feel. So what you're saying isn't true, it isn't false. It's nonsense, really. It's nonsense because you think you're saying something about how the world is, but you're not. You're saying something about how you feel, and that's different. That's very much where Ayer is going to go with this. Moral utterances say nothing about the world at all, and so they are nonsense from that perspective. Okay. And finally, question 8. The most problematic attack on the verification principle, well, as Leiswing points out, it fails its own test. Yes. So how do you show the verification principle itself is true? Well, it's not a relation of ideas. It's not analytically the case that things have to be verified to be meaningful. That's you have to argue for that claim. But there's no empirical evidence you could give to show that that claim is true either. How would you prove that things have to be verified to be meaningful? So it feels like it's just a gut feel from A.J. Ayer and the logical positivists. Well, if the verification principle is true, then things which are just gut feels without any analytic content or empirical content are themselves nonsense. So the verification principle of the logical positivists is, by its own standards, nonsense. Okay, now I appreciate this is quite complicated, which is why I've done this video running through it. However, some of you have done some really good answers, some of you have found only 2 or 3 questions difficult. A lot of you didn't really think about 4 and 5, which is why I've put some effort into those as well. I hope the video has helped.